So, good morning. My name is Neil Maiden from City University of London, and I'm going to be presenting a paper entitled Designing Digital Content to Support Science Journalism, and it's written with both computer science and journalism co-authors listed here. So the talk is reasonably straightforward. It's in three main parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about what I think many of us now perceive as challenging science communication issues in 2020. I'll then report on how we used expert interviews with experienced science journalists and communicators about understanding what might be effective in terms of the content that we need to communicate science to the public more effectively. And the results of those interviews led us to co-design and prototype a new digital tool that is intended to be used by journalists and science journalists writing about science, perhaps not as part of their main job, but an increasingly important part of their job. And then at the end, we'll finish off with just summarizing the next steps. So communicating science in 2020 has become, I think, a hot topic that is of interest to many people in society. Just to give you a working definition here, science communication is the organized, explicit, and intended actions to communicate scientific knowledge, methodology, processes, or practices in settings where non-scientists are a recognized part of the audience. So essentially, it's how do we sort of take our findings, our lessons learned from good science and communicate them to the wider public. Now, I think through much of my scientific career, and I suspect many people in the audience, we kind of took this as a granted activity that science would be accepted and understood by most of society. However, today, I think it's fair to say we live in what is sometimes called a post-truth world. And that world is requiring us to communicate science in better, more effective ways than we've done in the past. And if you doubt that claim, you only have to think about the rejection by large swathes of the population regarding the climate crisis, the effectiveness or otherwise of vaccines such as measles, and now in 2020, the denial of COVID and its actual existence, even though it's killing hundreds of thousands of people. And this need for a better science communication is happening against the background of generally fewer science journalists that are employed in news organizations, and the fact that many science journalists and journalists writing about science are working to increasingly shorter deadlines as the news and other organizations that they work for become increasingly resource limited. So we face a challenge that we have to try and solve with fewer resources. And our solution was to explore whether or not we could design new, more bespoke digital support for journalists writing about science and science-related topics, so as to try and redress this problem a little bit and deliver more effective support that could result in more effective science communication. So we adopted overall a participatory design approach, and in the first phase, which is reported in the first part of our paper, we used semi-structured interviews to interview 18 science communication and science journalism experts from 6 European countries. These people were experienced and recognized science journalists. They were more general freelance science communicators. They were editors of scientific journals. One was a science press officer at a university, and one was a science communication academic who also was an experienced practitioner. And in each of the interviews, the semi-structured questions were used to probe and explore the different science communication challenges and effective practices that they had developed over the years to communicate science more effectively. So we undertook different kinds of analyses, and those analyses led us to extract 4 key themes that emerged from the 18 interviews. Each interview lasted between half an hour and I think 1 hour 20 minutes, so there was a large corpus of data and information for us to analyze. The first key outcome was reinforcing what we'd identified in our preliminary research, which is that journalists writing about science lack both time and resources. They don't have the budget, they don't have the time to investigate stories properly, and they often also don't have the scientific expertise. So some quotes here from participant number 3. As an individual journalist within that unit producing science content, the challenges are funding. because everybody's being squeezed. This is due to the lack of resources flowing into news organisations. Another one of our experts said, well, the main challenge I face now is the fact that there are only 5 reporters and 2 political writers, so we're massively understaffed. What does that mean for science communication? And a third said, there's a definite lack of budget earmarked for science journalism in most of the mainstream media. So in spite of the importance of science journalism, it's being relatively underfunded. The second finding we found across a large number of our respondents was that they used quite a wide range of digital resources in order to understand and discover scientific topics to write about. So yes, they used academic papers, but they also used scientific news alerts, more general news sources, not just the scientific columns, but more general news columns. They followed scientists on Twitter, they used personal contacts, bloggers, Google search. So we were rather surprised at sort of the range of sources that were used, even to write single articles on science. So one respondent said, yeah, I get Eureka Alert, but again, everyone else does, so that's of limited use to me to get novel angles on stories. Another said, Twitter, obviously, for just staying up to date. Scientists use Twitter a lot, which I think is a correct observation, so using Twitter was an important source. And a third said, I get my everyday news. To get my everyday news, I try to get as broad a range as possible, but mainly the New York Times, the Guardian, and the BBC website. So perhaps trying to understand science and scientific challenges in a wider societal context. The third theme that emerged from the interviews was that science journalists and more general journalists writing about science clearly need a better definition of their audiences. We talked about science journalism is for non-specialist audiences, but those audiences are very diverse. And increasingly, the experienced journalists were learning to write directed content in particular styles focused on particular channels. So this radio journalist said, yes, we've really tried. We've really changed the way we make programs to try to appeal to different groups of people. And we're obviously trying to attract a younger audience to science journalism. Likewise, another respondent said, much more focus now on just meeting readers where they are. So focus on social media, just not necessarily expecting them to come onto your site, but just giving them the news, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter. So focusing very much on the channels that is being used for communicating science. The final strategy was the final outcome was the need to explain science as an overarching strategy. So a couple of respondents said, I see my job as explaining a bit more than, say, a political editor would. The need to explain the science so it's appreciated and understood to different audiences. But it's not only storytelling, but you also have to explain things to put them in context and so on. And this posed challenges for journalists who weren't trained as scientists, who didn't even maybe have a first degree in a scientific topic. So these 4 themes led us into a creative phase of digital tool development. And the result was a digital prototype that was intended to be used by science journalists as well as journalists who write about science topics, but maybe also write on other areas. The first feature of the tool was that it had a degree of automation of tasks that the journalists would typically be undertaking manually. So rather than require them to use Google searches manually to discover information, rather than require them to go to science journals to look at articles, we would try and bring them through degrees of automation to the journalists. And to do that, we embodied a large range of diverse digital sources. These could be newspapers, these could be articles, these could be Eureka alerts. We were essentially trying to create a one-stop digital shop for writing about science journalism. In order to support the science journalists to focus on specific audiences for the work that they write, we used existing research that had looked at science audience segments, and in particular the audience segments that are less engaged with science, to develop a set of science audience persona, borrowing on the ideas from design and design activities. So the tool was also populated with a range of different science audience personas that the journalists could work with in order to direct their writing. And then finally, we also developed a range of strategies based on rhetorical structure theory that would be there and embedded within the tool, as you can see here with a couple of pop-ups, to guide them to think about different strategies that they could use to explain particular concepts related to stories. So the result of this sort of aggregation of content and existing and developed content led us to build a first digital prototype. And we prototyped that both in a digital form, and we mixed it up with early paper representation. So you can see here you have an early version of the digital tool in which we've overlaid paper descriptions of the different science personas and presented these to journalists for feedback. And that led us to build kind of mock-ups, interactive mock-ups of different forms of the tool. So you can see a version of the tool here pulling out relevant information and content about flu vaccines relevant to the anti-vaccine threat to the use of these vaccines. And we prototyped these, we walked through these different prototypes with journalists, typically not science journalists, but journalists charged with writing about science in different formats. So there was print journalists and broadcast journalists involved in this prototyping exercise, discovering feedback, needs, and further features. Interestingly, one of the features or the requirement for additional content that we talk about in the paper came from a number of broadcast journalists who pointed out that they would typically have 90 seconds to 2 minutes to explain a complex scientific concept to quite a large audience on a regional television channel. So as a result of that, we then undertook further academic research, and that research led us to develop almost 70 metaphors that we'd identified in the literature as being effective for communicating either about climate change or vaccine use, or a third topic we were interested in, which is the role of AI in changing society. So you can hear there's an example of a metaphor seeing the climate as the Earth's thermostat, and you can see how a user might interact creatively with that metaphor. Another one here about herd immunity, which clearly is having a lot of press coverage at the moment with COVID. And one idea from the AI domain that AI bots are a bit like dumb waiters that you have for lifting food up and down floors in restaurants. And all of these metaphors were designed to be interactive, as were the science audience personas. So as a result of the addition of the metaphors, we then undertook further prototyping work to refine and improve the prototype with journalists. And that's led us to where we are now. We've identified quite a set of robust features for supporting general purpose journalists writing about science in more effective and cost-effective ways, and we need that cost-effective angle in order to be able to persuade editors to buy into the tool. So we've now moved away from a separate prototype developed within the INQUEST project, and we've integrated the features that I presented here, plus other features that have been developed outside of what was reported in the paper, into a new software product which is called JECT.AI, which is intended to support journalists to be more creative and productive when they're writing stories more generally. So the INQUEST features, the science audience personas, the scientific content, the explanation strategies and so on are embedded into this product. And at the moment, we are talking to a number of high-profile science magazines as well as newspapers to have them, before the end of 2020, use and evaluate the INQUEST features within the AI product to see how effective they are in science writing. So the next steps are very much focused on evaluation in different work contexts, and we hope to report that in the future. So just to summarise, the project is funded by European Commission's Horizon 2020 INQUEST project. Information is on the slide, and I think my 15 minutes are almost up. So I will stop here and take any questions and or criticisms that you might have. Thank you.